Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video, we're going to be adding a bunch of things that we need in our project in order to run it on Heroku. Now, the first thing we have to add is a way to tell Heroku what Python version we're using, and indeed, that we're using Python. So let's right-click on our code folder and add a new file, which we have to call, this is important, runtime.txt. It's going to tell Heroku what sort of language and what version we're using. And the contents of this have to be Python-3.5.2. Okay, that is it. Now, over time, this version may change. So do be aware that it may go up to 3.5.3 in the future and so on. I'll have a link in the lecture description so that you can go and see if this is still the latest version and you can change that if not, okay? So for now it's Python 3.5.2, but that may change in the future. So keep an eye on the link in the lecture description, okay? So that's the runtime.txt, and that's everything that should contain. Then we're also going to need to tell Heroku how to install the libraries that we are using in this app. So remember, we're using Flask, Flask RESTful, Flask JWT, and Flask SQL Alchemy. So we have to tell Heroku that these libraries are in use and that it should install them. Python has a standard way of telling other systems what libraries we're using, and that's in a file called requirements.txt. Once again, the spelling is really important, requirements.txt. And in here, we just put the library names that we're using. So we're using Flask with a capital F, Flask RESTful with REST in caps, Flask JWT, and Flask SQL Alchemy. Okay. Now, I remember also mentioning in the lecture at the start of this section that there's something called UWSGI. UWSGI is used to interact with our Flask app and make it available for others to go and access it. Flask can do this as well, but it's just not quite as good. UWSGI gives us things like more efficient multi-process support. It gives us things like restarting processes if they hang up and things like that. So we're also going to install that, UWSGI. You don't have to install UWSGI in your computer. If you're using an editor such as PyCharm, as soon as you create this requirements.txt file and you save it, it will tell you whether you want to install UWSGI, and in your computer you don't have to install UWSGI, okay? If you try, it is likely it will fail because you need a C compiler to install UWSGI, so don't bother, don't worry about it. You don't need UWSGI locally. Heroku will be able to install it and will use it, okay? That's it for the requirements.txt file. Next, we have to create another file called uwsgi.ini. UWSGI, make sure to spell it right. And what's going to go in here is some configuration parameters for the UWSGI process to run our app. Okay, so the first thing to do is to tag it. We're going to say UWSGI, that's going to be the section. And underneath it is going to come the configuration parameters. The first thing we have to tell it is what port it is going to run on. Normally, as you remember, we're running our Flask apps on 127.0.0.1:5000. 5000 there is the port, but Heroku has a very specific port that we must use, so we have to tell it HTTP socket is going to be : $port, like that. And what that's going to do is that's going to read the port number from the Heroku configuration. So we don't have to know the port number exactly. Heroku is going to tell us when we use this file. Next, we're going to say master is true. That means we're going to use a master process when we run UWSGI. That's something a bit more complicated. Essentially, there's going to be a process controlling the other processes, which are called slave processes. We're going to have die on term equal to true. That's when a process terminates. We're going to kill the UWSGI process just to free up the resources. We're going to tell it the module, which is going to be app.app, app:\app. And this probably looks mildly familiar. The module that we're running is the Flask app that we're running. So that's inside app.py, and the variable is called app. So it's going to look at that variable, and that's what it's going to run as a UWSGI application. And finally, we can also tell it memory-report is true. We probably will not use this in Heroku, but nevertheless, it might be interesting for later on. Okay, so this is everything. We tell it the socket that we want to run on. We say that master is true, so it has a sort of master process. We kill it when the process terminates, and then we tell it the module, which is going to be the app.py file and the app variable. And we're going to also initialize the memory report as well. Okay, and the last thing that we need is a proc file. So that's just proc file with a capital P. And what we're going to put here is what dyno we want to use in Heroku. Remember, a dyno is the server, but dynos have specific types. This dyno is going to connect to a HTTP port. For example, our app runs in port 5000. This dyno here is also going to be listening on that port to receive incoming requests. So it's important that it is a dyno of type web. So we type web, and then we're going to tell it what process it's going to run, what application it's going to run. So here we could do something like Python 3.5 app.py, for example, and that would presumably use the Python 3.5 process to run app.py. But we're not going to do that because we're using UWSGI. So all that we have to do is say UWSGI, UWSGI.ini. And what that's going to do is what you would expect. Run the UWSGI process with this file, which is the configuration file that we've created. And that is then going to load up the Python app and run that. So when we run the UWSGI process, that is going to listen in to this module, it's going to run that, and that's going to start our Flask application. Okay, so hopefully all of that makes sense. That's what we need for our deployment. So now let's go back to Chrome here. Well, actually, we'll have to go back to the terminal, apologies, and make sure to commit. So git status, look at that, git commit, git add star. And now these are all new files, so we're gonna git commit them, adding Heroku required files for running, for example. And then we're gonna git push. And now that we've set up the master branch to track the remote branch, we no longer need to do -u master. Okay. So that commit has now appeared in our remote repository. We can reload this to have a wee look. And you can see that the proc file, requirements, runtime, and uwsgi.ini have appeared, which is good. And then we can go back to Heroku here, and we have to do something very specific. We have to go to the settings, and in the build packs section here, the build pack section, make sure to tell Heroku that we're using Python. So all we have to do is we have to say add build pack, and then select Python there and save the changes. Okay, now that's added. Heroku is now going to use its Python stuff to run our code. So we can go to deploy once again, and we're going to go down here and deploy the master branch. Okay, let's see if everything wants to work. And as you can see, it detected the Python app via our proc file. It is now installing Python 3.5.2, which is what we told it to. And then it's, as you can see up here, installing the requirements.txt file. So it's going to install all of the libraries from the requirements.txt, and that includes Flask, Flask RESTful, Flask JWT and Flask SQL Alchemy, and also UWSGI. The other libraries there are Flask dependencies, such as Jinja, Click, and so on. Okay, and then it starts installing them, and it's installing everything down there. It's now installing UWSGI, which is the one that takes the longest. And once this is done, we're going to have our own server running our Python app. So let's have a look, see if we manage. It's declared the web type, and as you can see, it's now identified that this web type is valid. Now it's compressing the app at the very end so we can put it on the server, and then it's going to run it. And there you go. Now that's running. So we can go and click View, and really nothing should happen because this is a REST API and it's not meant to be running from a browser. And as you can see, we get here an application error. Okay. But that's the deployment valid, and now we are able to get our application deployed to Heroku. In the next video, we're going to look at running the app successfully and interacting with it from Postman, but just know that your API is now live on the internet and others can access it as well. So congratulations, we now have our first deployed app out there on the internet. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you on the very next one.